Chapter 2. This is the book, Journey Outside. And the last thing we knew is that Dilar jumped off of his boat that was going round and around in an underground cave, and he's just made the decision to see if it's been repeating the same trip around and around. Chapter 2. Dilar crouched on the ledge of rock, staring down the tunnel at the point where the frail gleam of the last torch had disappeared. He had done it for once and all. For a long time he stared into the twilight, imagining how it would be when the raft people came that way again and found him on his rock wall. What would Grandfather say and Bimar? Would it make Grandfather laugh for once, or would he be sadder than ever? The torch fluttered, and the little flame, which had not yet caught properly, almost died. Dilar sprang up from his dreaming and looked at it anxiously, and suddenly he was frightened half out of his wits. Suppose he was wrong! Suppose the rafts never came this way again! Suppose he must live for the rest of his life on this narrow shelf, never to see another human being again! He drew a deep breath and held it to keep the panic from rising up in his throat, making him scream. There was no use in screaming. Those on the rafts might hear, but what good would it do? He could try to swim after them. The current here was so strong it could carry him faster than he could swim, but it carried the rafts quickly too. He had waited too long. He would never catch up with them. He would grow exhausted and drown in the rough water without even coming within sight of the procession. No, he had behaved stupidly, like fish that in panic sometimes swim into the nets instead of away from them. But he was alive. He had fire and a net. The river teemed with fish. His people had long ago learned to make use of every fish scale and strand of weed in the river. He could keep himself alive until the rafts came around again, he told himself firmly. He knew it was true. They would come again. It was not only that he had noticed the same caves and rocks, and also that he read the answer in Geimel's eyes, in Bimer's father's black looks in a dozen ways. He examined his torch, a great snail shell wedged into a split in a big fish bone. The shell was filled with bits of dried fish organs and water plants soaked with fish oil. The torches did not make a very bright light, but they burned a long time. Now Dilar stirred the oil and blew gently on the weeds to make his burn more steadily. Then he walked along the narrow platform of rock, exploring as best he could by the dim light. At first he walked in the direction of the current, but after a few minutes he turned resolutely around. The rafts would come from the other direction when they returned. He would walk to meet them as far as the stone path would allow him. It allowed him a good distance, far more than the length of one of the long rafts. The way was uneven and full of cracks. He stumbled often, and pebbles hurt his feet. But he went on until the ledge grew so narrow that he worried about falling into the water and putting out his torch. He was tired. First he would sleep, and then when he woke, he would set about making a better arrangement for himself. He would catch fish to eat and to dry, and more important, to use for fuel. He would build a fire on the ledge and then take the torch and search as far as he could in either direction. Then if he fell in the river with his torch, it would be no matter. He would still have fire. He retraced his steps until he found what seemed to be the widest part of the ledge. He wedged the torch into a crack and inspected it to see that it would keep burning, even if he slept for a long while. He believed it would. At last he lay down to sleep, but how hard and cold the rock was beneath him! And how strange the water sounded, lapping and lipping against the wall, not running and murmuring under the raft logs. Wasn't it better to go around and around in company of his people than to stay still forever alone? Alone, alone, alone. He sat up in sudden despair and anger and heard scurrying noises and felt something brush over his hand. He leaped to his feet and glared about him. In the dimness, he could see them crowding along the stone shelf, sliding over each other, leaping up the cave walls, sharp-nosed, hump-shouldered, naked tail, when they came close enough to see the light in their eyes gleaming evilly red with rage. Diller had glimpsed them once or twice before, watching from the walls. He had not known what they were, nor did any of the other raft people. Once in a great while, one of the creatures would drop into the water and swim alongside the flotilla, and Grandfather said they even came aboard the rafts when everyone was asleep. Grandfather was afraid of them, and Weimar's mother for their ugly, hateful looks and sharp teeth and scaly tails. And now all at once Diller was a little frightened of them. There were hundreds, thousands of them, just outside the ring of faint light with his torch, pouring restlessly back and forth, the strange slithering sound of their bodies filling his ears and making him shiver. Once in a while there would be a shrill squeal or a sharp clitter. Diller looked around for a rock to throw. There were only pebbles. He leaned over and snatched up his torch. The creatures fell back a little, but in the brighter light Diller achieved by holding his torch higher, he saw more and more of them hurrying toward him. They crowded on the ledge, pushing and shoving, and once in a while there was a splash as one fell in. What did they want of him? Diller asked himself. They were different from fish, he could tell that. Thousands of fish might crowd around him in the water, nibbling at his legs, tickling along his spine, but he might grow annoyed at them, might kick out and splash to drive them away. But he was not afraid of them. The sight of them did not give him a sudden spasm of loathing somewhere in his stomach the way the sight of these things and their long yellow teeth did. Whatever they wanted of him, it wasn't anything good. Now either they were pushing forward more strongly or they were growing bolder. Inch by inch the nearer ones were creeping toward him. Their eyes blazed fiercely. Diller waved the torch and tried to shout at them, but he was too terrified. His voice strings made no answer to his orders, and he merely gaped. The things came closer. Diller backed toward the wall. One of them darted in at him, and this time he did yell, and leaped back by a foot only to brush against one hanging on the wall. He turned and almost flung the torch at the creature. He had all he could do to keep it clutched in his hand. Whatever happened, he must not lose his fire. They were crowding him back into the wall. He couldn't stand to have them touch him. He pressed against the rock, glancing up to see if any of them were clinging to it above his head. There was a crevice in the wall to one side of him, a deep crack. If he slid into the crack, it would keep the things from approaching him from right and left anyway. He crammed himself into the opening, and only then, wedged in, did it occur to him that there might be others in there with him. Hastily, he turned sideways and tried to touch the back of the narrow slot, but his exploring hand found only empty air. The creatures, seeing him retreat, surged forward, and he squeezed himself further into the crevice and touched a smooth boulder, and then suddenly he was all the way inside the narrow little cave and climbing up. He pressed against the stone and hitched himself up on his feet and elbows and his bottom. He still clutched the torch and looked down. He could see the things trickling into the cave after him. Could they climb up here? Perhaps. They seemed able to climb almost anything. The boulder felt smooth to him, but no doubt they could find claw holds. He inched slowly to the top, and behind him there was another of the tall, smooth, rounded rocks. He tried to see where he was and what was around him, but the shadows and flickering light confused him. The only way open seemed to be up. There was a scratchy sound, and the narrow, wicked heads and the gleaming eyes of the things showed over the rim of the stone. The boulder at Diller's back was steeper and harder to climb. He dared not turn his back on the creatures, but slid backward up this stone too, still holding the torch. He struggled on and once slipped and thought he was going to land right in the middle of all those claws and teeth, but managed to stop himself. Away from the water, the sounds of the beasts were louder than ever, their cries and angry chatter and the sound of fur brushing across fur, which set Diller's teeth on edge, and the scrabble of their claws on rock. They were flooding into the crevice now, scrambling all around him, and he yelled out in horror. For a minute, they were all frozen as his voice resounded monstrously in the narrow space. But when the echoes died, they came on, thousands of them, closer and closer, and he climbed steadily, though he trembled all over. Something clawed at his foot, something scrabbled at his ankle. In terror and desperation, he flung the torch down among them. The squeaks and chippers rose to a shriek, and both his hands free now, he climbed fast, panting and half sobbing. After a minute or so, the air around him felt different. The rocks felt wet and slippery. He did not know what he was coming to, but he climbed through the darkness, hoping for any sort of help. And suddenly, he felt space about him. The air was damp and cool and fresh, different from any he had ever breathed before. It was dark, darker than the tunnel. He could stand up at last. He stretched out his arms and felt nothing. The rocks still rose slightly beneath his feet, but gradually they gave way to something soft and sandy, and then something strange and yielding, strands of something that whispered and bent beneath his feet. The things had left him. The air was full of noises, curious sounds he had never heard before and couldn't imagine the source of, but there was about them nothing ominous or evil, as there had been about the sounds of the things. He walked a long way, holding his hands out in front of him, stumbling occasionally over rocks and other objects, but finding nothing he could take hold of and nothing he could identify. There were no rock walls anywhere, no river, no cliffs, nothing solid except stuff on which he cautiously put his feet. The wetness was all around him, but he was accustomed to wetness, and at last, exhausted, he lay down and fell asleep, not daring to think what he would do when he awoke, or how he would get along without fire, or how he would ever get back to the rafts and the river. When he awoke, he could only suppose he had died. The darkness was beginning to lift. Opening his eyes, he looked straight up into the pale mists and clouds drifting away, pearly, shining, softly, billowing and rolling, letting him glimpse every now and then the endless, depthless, timeless, vast blue curve of the sky. And that's where we'll stop at chapter 3. What do you think were the things in the cave? What is it that Dilar is walking on that is strange and yielding, strands of something that whispered and bent beneath his feet? Journey Outside by Mary Q. Steele was first published in 1969. The version we have right now was published in 1979. It has had several covers. It's an oldie but a goodie.